My name is Florence Smith. I am 68 years old, and if I had to choose one sound to describe my life now, it would be silence, not the peaceful kind that settles over the English countryside at dusk, but a hollow silence that gnaws at the walls of my small Surrey cottage, like an unwelcome guest that will not leave. The day Edward died, the air seemed to collapse inside me, and though friends and neighbours came with casseroles wrapped in foil and whispers of condolence, their voices only skimmed the surface of my grief without ever reaching its depth. Like stones thrown into a bottomless well. I remember standing at the window that first night, staring at the oak tree Edward planted when Anna was born, and wondering how a tree could outlive the man who placed it in the earth. It felt cruel that roots could cling to soil with such certainty, while the hands that guided them had been stilled by death. The house, once brimming with Edward's laughter, with his habit of leaving the wireless on too loud and his slippers abandoned under every chair, became cavernous, each room an echo chamber of absence, the furniture no longer familiar but accusatory, reminding me that I was now its sole occupant. People often say grief comes in waves, but mine came like a tide that refused to recede, swallowing hours, days, whole weeks, until time itself seemed to lose meaning. I would brew a pot of tea and forget to drink it, stare at Edward's empty chair until the fire went cold, hear the clock strike midnight, and wonder if morning would ever dare arrive. Sometimes, in the stillness, I would almost hear him, the scrape of his boots at the door, the clearing of his throat before he spoke, and I would turn my head expecting him, only to be met with air. I began to understand that being widowed was not a single event, but a series of small deaths, the daily reminders of absence that carve themselves into your bones. I thought of the young girl I once was, standing beside him at the altar, filled with faith that love was eternal, and realized that even eternal things must wear a mortal cloak. Yet inside that silence, there was also something unyielding. A voice that said, I was still here, still breathing, still capable of carrying the story of the man I loved. I did not know then that silence can be a mask, that within its folds, secrets hide, waiting for the right moment to reveal themselves. All I knew was that my life, once shared with Edward, had narrowed into an echo, and that I would have to learn how to live with its emptiness before I could uncover what truly lay behind it. In the weeks after Edward's funeral, when the flowers had withered and the neighbours stopped knocking on the door with kind but hurried offerings, it was Charles Whitmore who remained, his presence seeping quietly into the hollow spaces of my days like the steady drip of rain on a slate roof. He had been Edward's friend since their school days, a man I had always known on the periphery of our lives, arriving at birthdays with a bottle of claret, or joining us for a round of golf in the summer, but never someone I imagined would sit at my kitchen table day after day, pouring tea into the mug Edward once favoured. Charles carried with him an ease that felt almost rehearsed, a voice pitched in that low, steady tone people use with the bereaved, urging me to eat, to rest, to simply carry on. At first I resisted his kindness, bristling at the idea that anyone could step into the space Edward had left. But loneliness is a cunning persuader, and soon I found myself listening for the sound of his car in the drive, grateful for the way he filled the silence without demanding I banish it entirely. He would bring groceries from the village shop, sometimes slipping a bouquet of daffodils into the basket, as though colour itself might coax me back into the world. And he had a way of speaking about Edward that felt like balm, recounting stories of their youth that I had never heard, stories that made me laugh through my tears, and for a moment allowed me to remember Edward not in death, but in life. We began to share small rituals, afternoon tea by the fire, quiet walks to the churchyard, where I laid fresh flowers on Edward's grave, conversations that trailed into companionable silences. His company was not love, not then, but it was light seeping through a heavy fog, and I clung to it the way a drowning woman might cling to driftwood. Part of me felt guilty for welcoming him, as if my loyalty to Edward required me to wallow in solitude. But another part whispered that perhaps God sends us comfort in unexpected forms, and who was I to refuse it? Charles never pressed, never asked for more than I was willing to give. But there was something in his eyes, a softness that lingered, that suggested he was waiting. I told myself I was too wise, too old, to be swept into anything resembling romance. Yet, when he reached across the table one evening to touch my hand, I did not pull away. The rain had been falling since late afternoon, that steady English sort of rain that lingers without violence, yet seeps into everything. And as it tapped against the windows of my cottage, I lit the fire and brewed tea, grateful when Charles appeared at the door with his familiar knock and that faint smell of wet wool clinging to his coat. We sat together in the sitting room, the kind of quiet companionship that had become our rhythm since Edward's passing, and for a while, the only sound was the crackle of the logs and the clink of china as we lifted our cups. It was then, with the storm outside cocooning us in its grey embrace. Charles cleared his throat in that deliberate way that suggested something heavy was pressing on him, and before I could prepare myself, he said, quite simply, "T had loved me for as long as he could remember." The words hung between us like smoke, curling into corners of the room where I could not chase them away. And I felt my breath catch as though I had swallowed something too large to contain. My first instinct was disbelief, for Charles had been Edward's friend, always steady, always loyal, the man who laughed beside us in summer gardens and toasted anniversaries with unshaking hands. And yet here he was, unveiling a truth that threatened to redraw every memory. I ought to have been outraged, perhaps, or at the very least suspicious. But instead I felt a strange warmth unfurl in my chest. Not passion exactly, but the recognition of being seen at a time when I had felt invisible in my grief. His eyes, glistening in the firelight, did not carry the hunger of a man making a careless advance, but rather the weariness of someone who had borne a secret too long. And that softened me against my better judgment. Still fragile, still raw from Edward's absence, I knew how dangerous it was to lean toward another so soon, yet loneliness is a treacherous counselor. And it whispered that perhaps life was not finished with me. Perhaps I was not destined to wither alone in a house echoing with ghosts. I did not declare love in return, but I did not retreat, and when his hand rested lightly over mine, I let it linger, hearing in the rain's persistent rhythm the possibility of a second chance blooming, delicate as a crocus daring to break through winter frost. Anna has always had a way of looking at me, as though she can see straight through the words I use to cover my feelings. And one evening, as we cleared the supper dishes, she set down a plate with more force than necessary, and said quite plainly that she was worried about how much time I was spending with Charles. I tried to laugh it off, to remind her that companionship is not a sin, that I am still a woman with breath in my lungs, and a heart that insists on beating even when it has been battered by grief. But she would not let it go. She told me that she had seen the way Charles hovers, the way his hand lingers at my elbow, the way he seems to step into every empty space Edward has left, and though her voice was calm, there was steel beneath it. I defended him fiercely, insisting that love after loss is not betrayal, but a form of survival. That allowing kindness to reach me is not a rejection of Edward, but a testament to the fact that life insists on moving forward. I reminded her that loneliness is a cruel disease, and that Charles has done nothing but bring comfort to me in days that otherwise blur together in grey silence. Yet when she kissed my cheek before leaving, whispering that she only wanted me to be careful, her words clung to me long after the door closed behind her. That night, as I lay in bed, the house groaning softly in the wind, I turned her warning over in my mind like a pebble rubbed smooth by restless hands. I thought of Charles's steady presence, of the warmth in his eyes, of the confession that had unsettled me, but also filled me with a fragile hope. And for the first time, I allowed a shadow of doubt to enter. Had I been too quick to welcome him, too eager to believe in the safety of familiarity simply because he had once been Edward's friend? Or was Anna too young to understand the peculiar ache of losing not only a husband but a lifetime of companionship? The way silence can scrape at the edges of your sanity until you clutch at any voice that promises relief. I told myself firmly that my judgment was still sound, that I was not some foolish girl blindly tumbling into affection, yet the seed of unease had been planted, and though I tried to bury it beneath reason and loyalty, I could feel it taking root in the quiet hours when I was left alone with my thoughts. It was on a Sunday afternoon, the kind that drifts by with the sound of bells ringing faintly from the church across the fields, when Charles leaned forward in his chair, his cup of tea untouched on the table between us, and suggested that perhaps we ought to think about combining our lives more fully. He spoke gently, as though testing each word before releasing it, reminding me of the practicality of two people in their later years, sharing a home, merging their resources, easing the burdens that can weigh heavily when faced alone. At first, his words startled me, for I had only just begun to steady myself in this strange new life. But the way he framed it was not about romance or possession, but about security, about ensuring that I would not have to shoulder the weight of widowhood without support. He spoke of finances as though they were pieces on a chessboard, to be moved wisely, not hoarded fearfully. And though I bristled at the idea of anyone managing what Edward had left me, there was also a strange comfort in his certainty, in the assurance that he was thinking of my future when all I could manage was surviving the present. I thought of the trust Edward had always placed in Charles, how he had welcomed him into our family circle without question, how he once called him the most reliable man he knew. That memory softened my resistance, as if Edward himself were reaching across time to tell me it was all right, that leaning on his friend was not a betrayal but an extension of the faith he had always carried. Still, something in me hesitated, a quiet instinct that warned against moving too quickly, but I pushed it aside, telling myself that caution had its place, but so did hope, and that perhaps this was a chance to begin again, not with reckless passion, but with companionship grounded in years of shared history. Charles reached for my hand as he spoke, his thumb grazing my knuckles in a gesture that was both tender and deliberate, and I did not pull away. I told him I would need time, that I could not make such a decision hastily, but he nodded, as though he had already expected this, smiling with the patience of a man who believed the answer would eventually fall into his favor. When he left that evening, his proposal lingered in the room like the echo of the church bells, unsettling yet oddly reassuring, a reminder that even in the shadow of grief, the world still pressed me to choose a path forward. The post arrived in its usual quiet shuffle through the letterbox, a small stack of envelopes landing on the mat as I was tidying the breakfast things. And among the usual bills and catalogues lay one that caught my eye, its heavy cream paper and embossed crest unfamiliar to me. Addressed not to me, but to Edward, as though the world had forgotten that he was no longer here. I held it for a moment, the weight of it oddly substantial, and a strange unease rippled through me, because I had thought I knew every bank Edward dealt with, every account we had built together over the years of marriage, and yet this name, printed boldly across the corner, meant nothing to me. I set it aside on the sideboard, telling myself it was likely some clerical error, perhaps an outdated record that had not yet been updated, and I carried on with my chores, trying not to dwell on it. Later that afternoon, Charles came by, his usual easy smile softening the edges of the day. And as we sat together with tea, I noticed his gaze drift toward the pile of letters. I thought little of it until I returned to the kitchen for more biscuits, and when I came back into the room, I caught the briefest flicker of movement, his hand slipping the envelope into his pocket with a swiftness that would have gone unnoticed had I not entered at that precise moment. He looked up at me with the same calm expression he always wore, asked me if I preferred milk or lemon in my tea, and I answered mechanically, but inside me something shifted, a sharp coldness crawling along my spine like the brush of a spider's web in the dark. I said nothing. Not then, for I could not trust my voice to remain steady. But the image of that letter, disappearing into his pocket, replayed itself again and again, each time accompanied by a gnawing question I could not silence. Why would Charles take it? And why so furtively? Perhaps he meant only to spare me the pain of business matters best left in the past, or perhaps the explanation was something far less innocent. That night, as I lay awake, the house pressing down with its old familiar silence, I thought of Edward's trust in him, of my own willingness to lean on his steadiness, and for the first time I wondered if I had mistaken comfort for safety. If the man I had allowed into my grief carried shadows I had not yet dared to see. That night the rain lashed against the windows and Charles had fallen asleep in the armchair by the fire, his breathing heavy, his head tilted back in a posture of complete ease, while I sat across from him with a book I could not read, my eyes flicking instead toward the leather briefcase, resting at his side like a silent sentinel. I had never paid it much mind before, but now, after the incident with the letter, its presence seemed to loom larger, an object that whispered of hidden truths. For a long while I tried to resist the urge, telling myself that a woman of my age ought not to stoop to such furtive trespass, that trust should be the foundation of any bond worth having, but suspicion gnawed at me until finally it overcame restraint. I waited until his breathing deepened into the steady rhythm of true sleep, then rose quietly, each creak of the floorboards sounding like a thunderclap in my ears. My hands trembled as I lifted the latch, half expecting him to stir, half expecting the contents to reveal nothing but papers of no consequence. Yet when the flap opened and I drew out a sheaf of documents, my breath caught. They were bank statements, neatly folded, bearing the same unfamiliar crest I had seen on the letter. And as I spread them across the table, the numbers leapt at me, great sums I had never known existed, tied in bold print to Edward's name. Page after page told the same story. Transactions hidden from me, movements of money so vast that they made my head swim. And in the margins I saw notes written in Charles's hand, notations that mapped a world of secrecy I had never been invited to enter. My grief, which had been heavy enough already, twisted into something darker. Suspicion mingling with sorrow, until I could hardly tell one from the other. Had Edward kept this from me willingly? Or had Charles woven himself into our lives in ways I had been blind to see? The thought that my husband, my Edward, might have shared confidences with Charles that he never shared with me, cut deeper than I could bear. I gathered the papers back into the case, hands clammy, heart thundering, and closed the latch as softly as I could. But nothing could silence the storm that had broken inside me. For the first time I felt not only widowed but betrayed, caught between the ghost of a husband I thought I knew, and the presence of a man who claimed to love me. Both of them now bound to secrets I could not yet untangle. I sat in the dim light of the parlour, the papers still burning in my memory, though I had carefully returned them to Charles's briefcase. And as the hours dragged on, I found myself wandering back through the long corridors of the past, to evenings when Edward and Charles had sat side by side, their glasses of brandy glinting in the firelight, laughing with the ease of men who had known each other since boyhood. I had trusted those moments, leaned upon them as proof that Edward was surrounded by steadfast friends, and I had believed that Charles's presence in our lives was a blessing, not a curse. Now those recollections struck me like shards of broken glass, cutting into the fabric of my grief until it bled with suspicion. I remembered Edward's words, often spoken with such confidence, that Charles was the most reliable man he knew. And I wondered bitterly if those words had been part of the mask, if the trust my husband had placed in him was genuine or complicit. The weight of betrayal pressed down with a cruel duality. For it was not only Charles's deception that haunted me, but Edward's silence. His choice to keep hidden the accounts that bore his name, the transactions I had been blind to for decades. Had he sought to protect me from knowledge he feared would burden me, or had he doubted my strength to share the truth? Either way, the result was the same. I was left with a hollowed trust, standing in the ruins of two men's secrets, one dead and one sitting across the hall asleep in my chair. It is a peculiar torment to doubt the man you buried, to turn over in your mind the possibility that the love you lived by was never as untainted as you believed. And yet that torment became my reality, gnawing at the edges of memory until every laugh, every handshake, every toast between Edward and Charles seemed like theatre, rehearsed to keep me blind. The fire popped suddenly in the grate, and I startled, as if the house itself had conspired to remind me that I was alone in my discovery, carrying the unbearable knowledge that both loyalty and friendship had been used as veils to conceal greed. It felt as though the ground of my entire marriage had shifted beneath me, and I could no longer tell if Edward had been a victim, a participant, or a coward. What I knew, with painful clarity, was that I had been left to carry the wreckage, betrayed by the past, and manipulated in the present, forced to question the very foundation of the life I thought I had lived. When at last the burden of secrecy grew too heavy to carry alone, I found myself turning to Anna, though I dreaded the look I feared she might give me. That mixture of pity and frustration children sometimes reserve for parents they believe have lost their footing. We sat in her kitchen, the scent of coffee drifting between us, and I told her everything, my voice unsteady as I described the letter, the briefcase, the hidden accounts bearing Edward's name, and Charles's hand closing over the evidence as though it were his by right. Anna listened with a stillness that unnerved me, her eyes fixed not on me, but on some point beyond, as if she were piecing together a puzzle she had long suspected existed. When I finished, silence wrapped around us, until at last she spoke, her voice low but edged with steel, saying we must act carefully, that rashness could undo us, that men like Charles know how to twist a story until the truth appears like folly. She told me she had a solicitor, a man she had worked with at her firm, someone who specialized in probate and fraud, someone who would understand the tangle of lies hidden beneath the polite surface of old friendships and long marriages. I felt at once a surge of relief and a pang of shame. Relief that I no longer had to carry the knowledge alone. Shame that my daughter had to be the one to steady me, when I had spent a lifetime trying to be her anchor. Yet as she reached across the table and took my hand, I felt something stir within me. A strength I had thought buried with Edward. A reminder that courage does not vanish with age. It only waits for the right moment to be summoned. I had always seen Anna as the child I nurtured, the girl with scraped knees and endless questions. But in that moment, she was the one leading me, her resolve clear, her eyes burning with a determination that made me proud even in my despair. It was a strange comfort to realize that grief had not ended the line of protection in our family, that where Edward's silence had left me vulnerable, my daughter's voice would rise to defend. As we parted that evening, I felt the first faint whisper of courage pressing against the walls of my chest, telling me that perhaps I was not as powerless as I had believed. The solicitor was a measured man, with a calm, almost judicial voice, the kind of voice that could steady stormy waters, yet as he spread the papers across his polished oak desk, I felt as though the ground beneath me had given way. He pointed to figures that blurred before my eyes, long strings of numbers that told a story of betrayal more devastating than any words could have done. For years, he explained gently, money had been siphoned from Edward's business, profits quietly diverted into accounts that bore Edward's name, but were, in truth, under Charles's control. He spoke of patterns too precise to be accidents, of signatures that had been placed with deliberate care, and as he outlined it all, the room seemed to close in around me. My husband's friend, the man who had poured brandy in our sitting room and toasted our anniversaries, had been feeding off the very work that Edward built with his own hands. And worse still, there was the possibility that Edward himself had known. The solicitor hesitated before saying it, as though reluctant to wound me further. But his words cut with a precision no hesitation could soften. It appeared, he explained, that Edward had chosen silence, perhaps believing he was protecting me, sparing me from a truth that would have destroyed my trust in both him and his closest friend. That thought struck me harder than the numbers on the page, for it meant that my marriage, the life I had treasured and upheld in memory, had been built in part on concealment. My grief, already a heavy stone pressing against my chest, twisted into something unbearable, a mixture of anger and sorrow that left me gasping as though the air itself had turned thin. I wanted to defend Edward, to cling to the idea that he had been deceived as I had. But the solicitor's careful words left little room for such comfort. He had known, or at the very least suspected, and he had chosen not to tell me. I sat there, staring at the figures that represented not just money but trust, squandered, love compromised, loyalty betrayed, and I felt the collapse of two men at once, the living one who still lingered in my house with practiced gentleness, and the dead one, whose silence now rang louder than his voice ever had. It was a truth I could scarcely bear, yet it was mine now, written in ink that could not be washed away. Charles arrived earlier than usual that morning, his voice buoyant at first as he spoke of errands and the small business of the day. But beneath his words, there was a tautness I had not heard before, a kind of urgency that quickened the rhythm of our conversation. He drew his chair close to mine at the kitchen table, the smell of his cologne sharp in the air, and laid out his suggestion once more, that we should finalize the merging of our lives, not just in companionship, but in finances, property, and name, so that I might never again worry about the weight of accounts or the burden of paperwork. His tone, though dressed in tenderness, carried the insistence of a man who had grown impatient, and I felt my pulse quicken as I realized he was no longer content with the slow drifting of our companionship, but sought a binding tether that would leave me with no room to turn away. I tried to stall, telling him that grief is not a guest that can be hurried from the house, that my heart still stumbled beneath its load, but his eyes darkened, and for the first time I saw the careful gentleness crack. Frustration edged his voice as he pressed me, speaking of security, of how Edward would have wanted me safe, of how a woman alone cannot be expected to manage such matters indefinitely. Yet beneath those words, beneath the cloak of concern, I caught a glimpse of something raw and unsettling, a hunger that flickered in his gaze, not the warmth of love, but the glint of possession, of greed disguised as care. The sight chilled me, for it felt as though the mask he had so carefully worn since Edward's death had slipped, revealing the man beneath, and I wondered how often he had hidden that expression from me, how many of his tender words had been threaded with calculation. I gave no answer, only folded my hands tightly in my lap and looked down. But inside me, a storm had broken, my sorrow twisting now with anger, my longing for companionship, battling with the certainty that what he sought was not my heart, but my security. As he rose to leave, his smile forced back into place, though his jaw remained tense. I knew with a clarity that could not be undone that the line between love and exploitation had been crossed, and I could no longer pretend not to see it. I set the table that evening with a steadiness that belied the storm within me, polishing Edward's old silver and laying out the china as though it were any ordinary supper, though every movement felt like a rehearsal for battle. The cottage glowed with candlelight, the air carrying the rich scent of soup simmering on the stove. And when Charles arrived, he wore that familiar smile, his eyes soft as he kissed my hand, never suspecting the trap I had set. Anna sat across from me, her expression calm but watchful, and beside her, the solicitor unfolded his napkin with the composure of a man accustomed to uncomfortable truths. We made polite conversation at first, talk of weather and village matters, until the bowls of soup were set before us, and the solicitor, clearing his throat, drew a folder from his case and placed the bank statement squarely on the table. The sound of paper sliding across the wood seemed to echo louder than thunder. Charles's hand faltered on his spoon, his face blanching as he glanced at the pages that bore his neat annotations, the figures undeniable. He stammered at first, grasping for excuses, muttering about misunderstandings and clerical errors. But when the solicitor pressed him with calm precision, his mask slipped entirely, and he lashed out, his voice rising, accusing us of ingratitude, of conspiracies, of failing to see all he had done to care for me. The outburst rattled the air, but I did not flinch. I looked at him steadily, my hands folded in my lap, and with a voice that did not tremble, I said the words that had been burning in me for weeks. You said you loved me, but love does not steal. The room stilled, even the fire seemed to quiet. And for a moment he stared at me as though he had never seen me before, his fury tangled with disbelief that I had found the strength to confront him. Anna reached for my hand under the table, her grip firm, and I felt the solicitor's gaze steady on me, anchoring me in the truth. Charles muttered something unintelligible, pushing back his chair with a scrape that cut through the silence, and he left without finishing his soup, the door slamming behind him like a final verdict. I sat there in the aftermath, my heart pounding but my spine unbent, knowing that though the fight ahead would be long, I had taken the first step out of fear and into the light of truth. The days that followed our confrontation moved with a strange dual rhythm, as though I were both walking through mud and floating above the ground, everything heavy, yet oddly untethered. And when the solicitor confirmed he had begun formal proceedings against Charles, the weight of secrecy I had carried seemed to loosen, even as another, more public burden settled upon me. News in a village travels faster than the wind across the fields, and soon whispers rose wherever I went, in the post office, in the greengrocer's, even in the pews of the church where I once found refuge. Some voices carried pity, soft sighs about poor Florence betrayed so cruelly, while others curled their mouths into doubt, suggesting I had exaggerated, that grief had turned me suspicious, that surely a man like Charles, so polished and generous, could not be guilty of such treachery. His reputation, once solid as oak, began to splinter under the weight of the solicitor's revelations, and I watched with a mixture of grim satisfaction and sorrow as people who had once clasped his hand with admiration now crossed the street to avoid him. Yet, for every whisper that condemned him, another questioned me, and I found myself exposed in a way I had never known, my private agony dissected like a specimen under glass. There were moments when I longed to retreat, to close the curtains of the cottage and hide until it all blew over. But then I would remember the numbers on those bank statements, the way Charles's voice had risen in anger when confronted, and the image of Edward's name tied to deceit, and I knew silence was no longer an option. Liberation and vulnerability twined together within me, leaving me raw but unbroken, And at night, when the house was quiet, I would sit by the fire and tell myself that truth is seldom gentle, but always necessary. Anna stood firm beside me, her presence a shield against the gossip, and the solicitor's steady professionalism anchored me when doubt threatened to creep in. Still, there were mornings when I could feel the sting of judgment in the air as I walked through the market, eyes following me as though I carried a scandal like a scarlet letter stitched to my coat. I bore it because I must, because in some strange way the whispers were proof that I had stepped out from the shadows of deceit and into the merciless light where every flaw is seen, but so too is every act of courage. I sat at the desk in the study, the same one Edward had used for decades, its surface still faintly scarred by the weight of his fountain pen, and I spread out the fresh parchment as though I were preparing not a legal document, but a declaration of my very soul. The solicitor's voice echoed in my memory, calm and steady as he guided me through the details. But it was my hand that moved across the page, my choice that shaped the future of what I had once thought of as ours, and now claimed fully as mine. For so long I had assumed my estate would pass simply, quietly, absorbed without question, into the life of the man who had sat so faithfully at our table. That wealth, however modest, can be a tool of both cruelty and grace. I wrote Anna's name with care, ensuring that she and her children would never feel the suffocating weight of uncertainty I had endured, setting aside a trust that would carry them forward when I no longer could. And then, with a steadiness that surprised me, I marked out a portion to be given to a foundation for women, women who, like me, had known betrayal in its many guises, women who had been silenced, doubted, dismissed, and who deserved a shield, stronger than whispers. As the ink dried, I felt a shift within me, a lifting of the fear that my name would be tethered forever to scandal and pity. Instead, I saw it cast forward into strength. A story not of a woman deceived, but of a woman who stood, who named the truth even when the world preferred the lie, who turned grief into a seed for justice. It was strange. Sitting in the same chair where Edward had once signed contracts with Charles, knowing now how those signatures had bound me into shadows, without my knowledge, and yet there was a kind of poetic justice in replacing them with this. A testament not of silence, but of resolve. When I sealed the envelope and pressed it into the solicitor's hands, I felt the weight of my decision settle, like a mantle, across my shoulders. Not heavy, but dignified, as though I had finally chosen the legacy that was mine to give. My life, fractured by betrayal, would not end in bitterness, but in strength, and my name would not be spoken in hushed tones of shame, but in voices that recognized the courage to stand unafraid. If you have followed me this far, then hear me now, for this is the final voice I will give to a story that once threatened to consume me whole. And I speak not as a broken widow, but as a woman who has clawed her way back to her own dignity. Love after loss is possible, I have learned that. But it is not the soft fairy tale many imagine. It is jagged and cautious, shaped as much by discernment as by longing, and it demands a clarity of spirit that grief often clouds. I believed Charles because he wore the face of friendship I had trusted for decades, because his voice was steady when mine shook, because in the hollow ache of Edward's absence I mistook his certainty for safety, and I forgive myself for that mistake. For to be deceived is not shameful, it is human. Yet forgiveness does not extend to the system that enabled him, the polite silence of business partners who looked away, the neighbors who preferred admiration over scrutiny, the very fabric of a society that treats widows as fragile and therefore easily guided. Trust, I have come to know, is the most sacred gift we give, and silence the most dangerous weapon used against us, for what festers in shadows grows monstrous, while truth, however painful, is the only light that frees. I do not tell you this tale to paint myself as a victim, though I was one, nor to revel in betrayal, though it nearly crushed me, but to offer a warning that even in grief, when our hearts are raw and our judgment blurred, there are those who will see us as prey, who will feed on our loneliness with promises of protection that are nothing but hunger in disguise. I reclaimed my dignity not in grand gestures, but in steady choices, in speaking when it would have been easier to stay silent, in rewriting the testament of my life so that my estate would serve justice rather than greed, in standing at last without trembling and saying, "Love does not steal." If my words carry anything into the world, let it be this: guard your trust, do not allow sorrow to strip away your discernment, and never confuse companionship with possession. My story is not about despair. Though despair was there, it is about choosing light, about unmasking shadows, about knowing that dignity once reclaimed can never again be stolen.